Good evening, everyone. My name is Anita Lahey. I'm a nonfiction editor with the New Quarterly. I'm pleased to welcome you to our 9th annual Wild Writers Festival. While we do miss our yearly in-person gatherings in Waterloo, this year's festival is unique because we are hosting viewers online from around the country throughout the month of November. I'd like to extend our heartfelt thanks to our festival donors and sponsors. We are grateful for their support of the Wild Writers Literary Festival. I'd also like to thank all the volunteers who have made the festival possible. Now tonight, I have the pleasure of introducing Anita Leahy. Anita is a past editor of ARC Poetry Magazine, and since 2018, she has served as series editor of the annual anthology Best Canadian Poetry, and prior to that, she was their assistant series editor since 2014. She's the author of 2 poetry collections, Out to Dry in Cape Breton and Spinning Sidekick. She has also published a collection of essays, personal reflections, and interviews, among other things, in a book titled The Mystery Shopping Cart, Essays on Poetry and Culture. Her latest work is a memoir titled The Last Goldfish, A True Tale of Friendship, and it is her session, Memoirs Companions, in which she will discuss the craft of memoir writing and the elements that help shape that process. Please welcome Anita Leahy.
Good evening, and thank you for that introduction, Lenise, and thank you to the New Quarterly for hosting Wild Writers, which is a wonderful festival, and I'm really happy to be part of it. I'm going to talk this evening with you all about Memoirs Companions. And there will be a chance. I have 6 companions that we're going to discuss, and we'll do them in pairs and have time for questions in between each set, for a question or two, and then time at the end. So any life may contain a story that begs to be told. The memoirist's job is to give this story shape and resonance. We imagine this as a solitary excursion into personal history. In some ways it is. A memoir writer, however, needn't retreat into seclusion. In fact, I'm here this evening to advise against it. Don't get me wrong, a healthy amount of solitude for a writer, if such is to be had, I'm all for it. Go for it, but don't get carried away. When we're done here this evening, I'll have banished all visions of lonely garrets from your writerly minds. In this session, we'll consider 6 companions to memoir making, not all of them human, that may make all the difference, not just to a book, but to an author's experience of writing it. So, companion number 1, doubt. This one, we all think we'd rather do without. Here's one of my favorite quotes on the subject of writer's doubt. It's from British author Vera Britton's 1940 memoir, Testament of Friendship, which is right here, about her friend and fellow author Winifred Holtby, who died in 1935 at the age of 37. During much of the time frame the book covers, Britton is hard at work, combing through her First World War experience, both as a nurse who went to the front and as a young woman who lost a brother and a fiance to the battleground, attempting to create a narrative from all that carnage that would speak to her generation's experience of the war. Sounds important, right? Britton sometimes had a hard time convincing herself of this. Here's the quote from her book. She writes, "While Winifred had completed Poor Caroline, Virginia Woolf, and Mandoa, this autobiography had plodded interminably along, the testament not only of youth, but of an undistinguished and retarded literary career. Again and again, convinced that the reading public would never be interested in the story of an obscure freelance writer, I was tempted to abandon it." When I read Britton's description of her recurring doubt, experienced 9 decades ago, I was floored. During the long, slow years of writing my own memoir, The Last Goldfish, which is coincidentally likewise about a dear friend who died young, I suffered the same qualms. In my case, though, who would care about the story of 2 young women from the suburbs outside Toronto, one of whom was, in Britten's words, an obscure freelance writer. That would be me. The other of whom died at 22, forced by illness to abandon her studies before even having earned an undergrad. Britten was drafting her manuscript while starting a family and building a reputation as a journalist and critic. There are times when the work was set aside due to half the family coming down with measles or chickenpox, to house hunt while pregnant, to meet some deadline, or to tackle Winifred's voluminous correspondence when she was too ill to do it herself. We all wrestle with the demands of daily life while writing. But I wonder if that tussle between priorities is felt especially keenly when we're writing a memoir. In our darker moments, we see this as an indulgent exercise in simply writing about ourselves. There are those who do lament the current popularity of the memoir genre. Isn't this onslaught of personal stories just a symptom of an increasingly narcissistic society? It's a fair question. But memoir has long found popularity among readers. Consider St. Augustine, T.E. Lawrence, Primo Levi, Helen Keller. As Eve Claxton, who compiled the Book of Life, a compendium of memoir and autobiography through time, has written, and I quote, "Contrary to popular belief, memoirs weren't invented in the mid-1990s. At its best, memoir is a piece of talking history, a single voice calling to us out of the midst of some profound historical event, or, as in my case, some everyday joy capped by tragedy. It's the micro tucking us down through the macro. It's the difference between watching a flock of geese veer off in the distant sky, a marvel for sure, and encountering a single goose alongside the river path, staring you down. It's someone's experience gathered up somehow like wind in a net, given shape and form, distilled. Even so, I had to ask myself, again and again I asked, what was compelling about my story? People make and lose friends all the time. People die of cancer or succumb to other cruel fates all the time. I doubted my story so keenly that for a time I tended to fictionalize it, inserting a cast of characters with a host of unrelated problems. I doubted our story contained enough meaning on its own. I doubted my ability to make Lou whole on the page. I doubted my powers of memory. More on that later. I doubted my motives. Why indeed was I writing this, beyond the obvious effort to make myself feel better? Doubt can derail you, but it also has its uses. It can force upon you some hard questions. Why write this down? Why does it matter? The answer to such questions needn't be groundbreaking. They need only be convincing enough to keep you at your desk. For in the end, if you've done your job, the work will make your case. One day, a sensible old friend helped me to see the thing I feared made my story unremarkable might actually be its strength. That is, just how commonplace it was. So many people go through this, she said. Don't you think they'd find comfort in reading about it? She also reminded me that our culture is so geared toward romantic love and family relationships, we often underestimate the crucial role of friendship in our lives, and people would be hungry for a story that went some way toward remedying that. I had known all of this, but I doubted it. Not constantly, but repeatedly. Doubt works on a rewind and replay mode. I'm sure all of you know about that. It functions like a form of forgetting. It keeps coming back to eat away at our better judgment. But maybe the circuitous route I took was my best way forward. The time I spent attempting to morph my memoir into fiction, it was a detour, but I was shaping scenes, I was bringing characters to life, I was putting words in their mouths. Even as I wrote my way into figurative wall after wall, I was embedded in the land of memories that was the source of my real story. I was gathering what I found there and regarding it with a calculating eye. So you find your answers to doubt's hard questions, find the friends who will help you remember those answers, and then get over yourself and get to work. Whenever that doubt reasserts itself, and it will, it might prove your most faithful companion, return to those Q's and A's. If you no longer believe your answers, figure out why. Were they insincere? Unrealistic? Do you need to find new questions? In this awkward, ricocheting fashion, with doubt haranguing you, you plot and replot your course. You write your story down. Companion number 2, memory. Kind of an obvious one, right? It's almost comical to bother even mentioning memory in the context of writing memoir. Unlike the novelist who might dabble in memory or borrow from memory, the memoirist operates under a duty to memory and dwells alongside it. And memories don't exactly make for restful company. I'm going to read you a quote from Jane Austen's Mansfield Park. This is when the protagonist, Fanny Price, who's normally quite subdued, exclaims over the dramatic growth of a shrubbery and how easy it is to forget how it once looked. Overcome by a fit of insight, yes, one brought on by a shrub in an English garden, this is Austen's world, Fanny declares, "If any one faculty of our nature may be called more wonderful than the rest, I do think it is memory. There seems something more speakingly incomprehensible in the powers, the failures, the inequalities of memory than in any other of our intelligence. The memory is sometimes so retentive, so serviceable, so obedient, at others so bewildered and so weak, and at others again so tyrannic, so beyond control." Nowadays, brain science tells us pretty much exactly what Fanny figured out while she was strolling through the garden. We can't rely on memory. For one thing, our minds are geared for narrative, and to achieve it, they will thread facts and impressions together in ways that distort reality. Canadian author Aslan Hunter addresses this in her essay, "The Truth Goes On Solving Nothing," from the collection A Ragged Pen, Essays on Poetry and Memory. Here, I have that one here to show you too. This is a wonderful book of talks, gathered and printed. And she asks, if, as much modern philosophy suggests, the world is fragmentary and unknowable, and if, as neuroscience now suggests, memory is influenced by a region of the brain that allows for inaccuracy in order to arrive at sense, what do we do with the idea of the real? Hunter's answer, in part, is to consider that what comes to life in the mind may be as real as the literal object before us in the world. It certainly may feel as real by virtue of the imaginative energy it took to create it. But what does this mean for the memoir writer? Obviously, it doesn't give us carte blanche to make stuff up. If we wanted to do that, we'd write fiction. When I was writing my book, I was frustrated by what felt like gaping holes in my memory. Could I quote Lou or even myself verbatim, for example? Of course not. Yet my story is built in large measure on our conversations. So how did I accomplish this? I used what I did recall as my guide. I knew our way of talking to each other, the pattern of our dialogue, and knowing that I'd absorbed through what was in essence one long conversation stretched over the 9 years of our friendship. Using our shared lingo, our mutual tone, our style of banter, the ways we riffed off one another's moods and minds, I reconstructed those conversations that had affected me most, those that mattered for the story I needed to tell. In fact, I began my story by simply writing down in early morning sessions at my desk before going to work every incident in our lives together that remained vivid in my mind. I gathered up our little scenes, our small plots, and while building them up word by word, I lived inside those memories. For a person embarked on the long path of mourning, it was a good place to be. But here comes our friend doubt. Would my memories of certain events have cohered with Lou's, or with my mother's, or with those of anyone else who appears in the book? In the epilogue to The Last Goldfish, I describe how I once interviewed my parents about Lou and me. Here's what I wrote. I sat across from them with a notebook. I wanted to know if my memories of those early years of our friendship meshed with theirs. Was it true that they'd been wary of her, but had been quickly won over? I remember being grateful that you'd found a friend, my mother said, that you weren't alone. I was thrown. Her answer was so at odds from what I recalled. But I didn't let that disparity alter the account that wound up in the book about how suspicious my mother seemed to my 14-year-old self of this new friend of mine, this chatty redhead who had divorced parents and didn't go to church. I had to trust that the tenor of our individual memories each represented one facet of a multi-pronged story, and that my own angle on things had settled the way it had for a reason. Memories can serve as portals. That an experience remains with us is alone evidence of its significance. But that's not the whole story. The way a memory cures in us reveals something about why it's there at all. Consider this. Many moons ago, I participated in the Banff Center for the Arts' amazing creative nonfiction and cultural journalism program. The chair of the program that year was Mexico City-based author Alberto Ruiz Sanchez. During our roundtables, whatever we were in danger of getting bogged down in doubts, there's doubt again, around unreliable memories, Alberto gently dug us out. He would tell us that a worthy piece of writing, whatever its so-called genre, bears the unique mark of the writer, and that outside of Anglo-Saxon culture, this question of whether a story is real or made up, fiction or nonfiction, isn't really dwelled upon. In his introduction to word carving, an anthology of work out of that program, Alberto writes, "It is precisely the author's perception of reality that transforms the essay into a valuable work of research, reflection, and creative experience destined for a community of readers." It's toward that community of readers that we're aimed. To get there, every writer needs to come to terms with their own perception of reality. For the author of Memoir, that means in part their relationships with memory and forgetting. Hilary Mantel describes her own such terms as follows in her brilliant memoir, Giving Up the Ghost. Here, I'm going to show you both those books. There's word carving with these beautiful carved pencils. Those were made by an artist who was at Banff that year. And here's Hilary Mantel's Giving Up the Ghost. So Mantel writes, "Part of our difficulty in trusting ourselves is that in talking of memory, we are inclined to use geological metaphors. We talk about buried parts of our past and assume the most distant in time are the hardest to reach, that one has to prospect for them with the help of a hypnotist or a psychotherapist. I don't think memory is like that. Rather, it is like St. Augustine's spreading limitless room, or a great plain, a steppe, where all the memories are laid side by side at the same depth, like seeds under the soil. The question for the writer, then, may be simply this: which seeds will sprout?" So let's do a little bit of Q&A. I'm looking on the question. So the first question that's in here is, how can you ethically and compassionately write the story of a person in your life? What were your guiding principles? So I had a bit of an easy time with that problem because I wasn't writing about someone who had done anything untoward. I was writing about someone who'd been a force for good in my life. And so I think that would be a difficult question if you were writing about a more challenging experience with a person. And I think I maybe partly answered it in how I was speaking about how you deal with memory. You need to trust the way an experience has settled within you and follow that. And if you're true to if you're true to telling the story and trying to solve what it means, why it has settled the way it has, then I think you are being ethical and compassionate, as opposed to, writing something deliberately to get back at someone or hurt them or win. So I think, my guiding principles were very much along the lines of following the threads of memory to see where they led. And here's another question from Aslan Hunter. Hello, Aslan. Do you think a caveat at the start of Memoir is enough to make it comfortable for the memoirist to reinvent remember dialogue-based scenes? Or can contemporary memoirists assume readers will accept that memory making is necessarily involved? Well, I hope we can assume that readers understand that a memoir is not a piece of journalism. It's not an autobiography. It's a story. It's a narrative. And so to shape a narrative, you need to piece things together. And what I did with my memoir is most of the names in the story are changed. Anybody whose name I could change, I did. So my immediate family, I used the real names because I couldn't really hide them. But I did want to grant privacy to people, partly because the story happened so long ago, and partly because of this discrepancy that you know will exist in people's memories, and to have some respect for that. I'm going to move on. I see there's another question there from Elizabeth Ruth, and I'll come back to it, but I'm going to move on to the next two sections. Okay. The next one is reflection. So these lead from, reflection leads out of memory. In a memoir, some memories need telling full stop. Others invite reflection and grow more resonant in its wake. That reflection arises from the natural filtering that takes place within us when we're not exactly looking. Its articulation is one of the gifts we seek as readers from literature. So now I'm going to read a quote from Winifred Holtby, who's the subject of that Testament of Friendship that I quoted at the beginning. In 1932, Winifred Holtby wrote a book about Virginia Woolf's writing called Virginia Woolf, A Critical Memoir. And in it, she describes the flashes of insight experienced by Woolf's characters as the moments of revelation which compensate for the chaos, the discomfort, the toil of living. The crown of life is neither happiness nor annihilation. It is understanding. These are the moments in which all the disorder of life these are the moments in which all the disorder of life assumes a pattern. We see, we understand, and immediately the intolerable burden becomes tolerable. We stand for a moment on the slopes of that great mountain, from the summit of which we can see truth, and thus enjoy the greatest felicity of which we are capable. The greatest felicity of which we are capable. It's not happiness, it's understanding. It's the opportunity to reflect one's way to a sense of clarity, however fleeting. This is the task of the memoirist, and those flashes of understanding and the language required to voice their essence become her companions. To piece the narrative of The Last Goldfish together, I flung all those memories I'd recorded down like crumbs and followed the trail they made. What did I find at their end? Only myself, but the me I am now, with the memories reaching out behind me. Looking back at them, the first thing to reckon with was just how many there were. All had been crucial for the journey I'd undertaken, but that didn't make them all relevant to the story I had to tell. I had to toss some of those memories, now reconstituted as scenes, away. This is where the art of memoir is the flip side of fiction. Instead of starting with a blank space and filling it with an alluring, made-up world, the memoirist must retrieve one defined reality from the vast overlapping jumble of a life. It took me years of retracing my steps up and down that long trail of memories to figure out what I needed in order to tell the story and what could be left behind. And my work didn't end there. In the book, I touch on the difference between two past tenses in French, passé composé and imparfait. For those of a certain age, this may bring you back to grade 9 French. It's a place where part of my story actually takes place, grade 9 French class. To review, the first represents an action or event wholly completed in a time and place. The second, something that was ongoing or habituated. Later in the book, I note that though I once naturally understood this distinction, it grows fuzzy now. As the years accumulate, as I bump into new friendships that mix and mingle inside me with those from the past, I resist the finality of passé composé. I lack faith in it. Grammar fails to account for memory and its workings. It's memory's workings that get interesting while you're writing. Things happen. One event connects to another in a way you didn't anticipate. Retelling an anecdote, moment by moment, may jolt a writer into an awareness of what was really going on at its core. Or what about it still stings? Or it may offer an unexpected sense of gratitude or joy. Isabel Huggins' memoir, Belonging, Home Away from Home. This is a wonderful book. It's a book I've read and reread throughout my adult life, and certainly throughout the years I was writing my own memoir. In it, she writes about coming to terms with living in places that don't feel in her bones like home. With each move, she brings a small blue bag of objects with her including the pearl buttons from her mother's Depression-era nursing uniform. She places these in a small stoneware jar. She writes, "Let the buttons slip through your fingers now, all 12, and contemplate the starched white cotton bodices and cuffs these pearl-faced clasps were meant to close. Consider the nurses' lives so carefully fastened, too. The way they dressed, so much a part of how they behaved as women. Think about my mother, who worried throughout her life about her too exuberant laugh. My awful horse laugh, she called it. Lips unbuttoned and mouth wide open. Unfeminine, she was told. See how Huggins has led from the buttons to an iconic occupation, to a strict social structure, to a woman's wide open mouth? When she opens the jar, she writes, my mother's voice comes out so loud and clear. Her mother, who loved her vocation as a nurse and always hoped Isabel would follow her into this honest work. My mother's laughing is now part of the fossil of my life, and I can't understand what it means, not yet anyway. And so I write about it, and the other memories that haunt me, until I do. We collect our memories the way that Huggins keeps her buttons and the other items in her little bag, and we run our fingers through them. Occasionally, when the light is just so and the air clear, everything that we attach them in our minds shakes loose, and we briefly see that everything and find the words to describe it. Okay. Companion number 4, craft, which you really just saw a great example of in that passage from Isabel Huggins. So you've got your purpose, otherwise known as mostly vanquished doubts. You've got your memories, your reflections. See, you're far from alone. You're surrounded, in fact. What do you do with all this stuff? This is where craft comes in. This is the good part. It's where you get to mold all this material into a form that makes sense, that anyone could perceive and find their way through. Sounds easy, right? I'm going to let Hilary Mantel take this one. Here she is again from Giving Up the Ghost. I hardly know how to write about myself. Any style you pick seems to unpick itself before a paragraph is done. I will just go for it, I think. I'll hold out my hands and say, c'est moi, get used to it. I'll trust the reader. This is what I recommend to people who ask me how to get published. Trust your reader. Stop spoon-feeding your reader. Stop patronizing your reader. Give your reader credit for being as smart as you, at least, and stop being so bloody beguiling. You in the back row, will you turn off that charm? Plain words on paper. Remember what Orwell says, that good prose is like a window pane. Concentrate on sharpening your memory and peeling your sensibility. Cut every page you write by at least 1/3. Stop constructing those piffling little similes of yours. Work out what it is you want to say, then say it in the most direct and vigorous way you can. Eat meat, drink blood, give up your social life and don't think you can have friends. Rise in the quiet hours of the night and prick your fingertips and use the blood for ink. That will cure you of persiflage. But do I take my own advice? Not a bit. Persiflage is my nom de guerre. Don't use foreign expressions. It's elitist. I stray from the beaten path of plain words into meadows of extravagant simile, angels, ogres, donut holes. And as for transparency, window panes undressed are a sign of poverty, aren't they? How about some nice net curtains so I can look out, but you can't see in? How about shutters or a chaste Roman blind? Besides, window pane prose is no guarantee of truthfulness. Some deceptive sights are seen through glass, and the best liars tell lies in plain words. It's a bit wicked, isn't it, to claim you haven't got a clue how to write a memoir while doing it with such verve and force. You'd never mistake this for a passage written by Michael Ondaatje, say, or Alice Munro. There's a Mantellian rhythm to each sentence, a particular music in how they slip and slide one into the next. What you have here is register and tone. There's a voice, and it's got something to say. And it's Hilary Mantel's voice. I hardly know how to write about myself, she writes. Eat meat, she writes. Liars tell lies. There's substance, stuff for a reader to touch and see. Like Huggins' pearl buttons, but not those. And if pearl buttons did turn up here, they'd be handled quite differently. Even in Mantel's expression of an abstract idea, there's particularity, palpable sense awakening particularity. An extravagant simile is a donut hole, an ogre. These are matters of craft that hold true for any form of writing, be it poetry, fiction, memoir, you name it. And they are crucial to practice, to sharpen and hone. On top of these, your story needs narrative drive, it needs structure. We could spend all evening, all month, working over any one of these. I spent years sorting out the structure for The Last Goldfish. Ought it be chronological, thematic, episodic, circular, interspersed with flashbacks? I tried several of these before finding the answer. Sometimes the structure required is more easily found, more obvious, and the voice ready-made. But you still need to drill down to the paragraph, sentence, word. Even character is a matter for the memoirist to get a handle on. You're not making people up, but you are taking real people from real life and, in essence, sculpting them out of words. Craft is comprised of the tools we lay out upon our writing tables when we sit down to work. Day to day, we have these tools with us, these implements. It's easy to forget they're here. We ought to take them out each morning and polish them to a brilliant shine. Your facility with a given tool, be it your way with dialogue, your ability to set a scene, your prowess with transitions, your knack for smoothing out the kinks in a sentence, will fluctuate. But over time, much time comprised of much writing, that facility will improve, and each tool, one by one, will become a trusted companion, one you can't imagine ever having done without. Okay, I'm going to go to questions again. I see there's a few there. So I'm going to go back to Elizabeth Ruth, who asks, how do you deal with reconstructing remembered conversation dialogue? So I touched on that a little bit. I guess I would say you remember, in my case, I mean, different people would approach this differently, but in my case, if I were writing a scene, and sometimes it was built around something that was discussed and that discussion needed to be in the story for some reason, but there's a germ of the conversation or an outcome that's very clear in your memory, and depending on the scene it takes place in, I would build the conversation around that, and I would remember the gist of what we said to each other. And once I started writing the conversations, they would just flow. And I felt like it was because anyone in the book was someone I'd had many conversations with. So the tenor of those conversations is kind of embedded in me. So I would be drawing on that. And different writers would answer that question differently, but that's how I would approach it. And once I started doing it myself, I understood, for example, I remember years ago reading Frank McCourt's memoir, Angela's Ashes, which begins with memories when he was a very young child. And in those memories are these long exchanges between his parents that I couldn't imagine a 5-year-old remembering, and I didn't understand how he did that. But now I understand, which is he lived with those people for his entire childhood and heard them talking to each other every day. So he was able to reconstruct their conversations in a way that felt true. So I hope that helps answer a little bit. It's sort of weird doing this without being in the room and people being able to back and forth with me when I try to answer the questions. What kinds of pitfalls were there in writing about a positive force in your life? Was it hard to do without idealizing them? In some ways, yeah, at first. Especially, I don't want to scare anyone, but I did start doing this when I was quite young. I was 22 when the friend I was writing about died, and I'm now in my late 40s. Most people don't take that long to write a book, and most people don't need that long to write a book. But I went, moved away from it, went back to it over the years. And in the early years, I think I was really writing down from a place of pure, raw grief, my love for my friend. And I would not have wanted to go back then to places of tension between us. or places where I didn't understand her, or you know, where she could be considered in any kind of critical way. I felt protective of her because she had been taken from her life. So yeah, it would, yeah, you have to, that's kind of a pitfall of any kind of writing out of loss, I think. And it partly takes time to cure that, and which allows some perspective. um, I once wrote an essay about eulogies that talks a lot about the pitfalls of the eulogy in that regard. So you're not, when you're writing a memoir, wanting to write a eulogy. It's definitely not the same thing. I'm going to do one more question, and then I'll go back to the last two companions, which actually start to involve people. A memoir somewhat is based on a linear chronology of time. Would you recommend to jump back and forth in time to make the story more interesting? I guess it's, you know, that's going to be circumstantial. It's going to depend on your story. It's going to depend on your writing style and the pacing of your narrative, and yeah, like the sort of substance of your story. So you kind of have to follow the momentum where it leads you. And if the momentum leads you back in time and then forward again, then that's the way you need to go. And I can only say, try it out and see if it works. And if it doesn't work, then try it a different way. And you can get feedback from trusted readers to help you figure that out, which is something I'm going to come to in the next. So I'm going to save the questions here and come back to you very shortly. So 2 more companions. Here we go. Lost. Here we go. Companion number 5 is, whoops, that's companion number 3. Where's my sign? Companion number 5, books and authors. I doubt anyone here today needs to be convinced that our favorite books and favorite authors are often our companions of choice. That's a pitfall of being an avid reader and a writer. Sometimes we read for research and learning, sometimes for an example to follow, and sometimes for pure pleasure, and sometimes all 3 together. American author Francine Prose has actually written a book on this subject, and it's here, Reading Like a Writer, a guide for people who love books and for those who want to write them. This is about how important the act of reading, especially reading consciously, is when you want to be a writer and for a writer's development. She writes, in the ongoing process of becoming a writer, I read and reread the authors I most loved. I read for pleasure, first, but also more analytically, conscious of style, of diction, of how sentences were formed, and information was being conveyed, how the writer was structuring a plot, creating characters, employing detail and dialogue. And in fact, to follow up on that last question I was answering, another way to try and find the answer to your question is to look at the memoirs you like and how they're structured, and maybe even ones that are telling a story in the same family of the kind of story you're trying to tell, and see how other people have done it. And so this is to continue Francine Prose's quote. As I wrote, I discovered that writing, like reading, was done one word at a time, one punctuation mark at a time. It required what a friend calls putting every word on trial for its life, changing an adjective, cutting a phrase, removing a comma, and putting the comma back in. I read closely, word by word, sentence by sentence, pondering each deceptively minor decision the writer had made. And though it's impossible to recall every source of inspiration and instruction, I can remember the novels and stories that seemed to me revelations, wells of beauty and pleasure that were also textbooks, private lessons in the art of fiction. Could anyone come up with a more pleasing model for an apprenticeship than to spend one's time falling into the wells of beauty created by one's favorite authors? It would be folly for me to offer a complete library of the books that kept me company during the years I worked on mine. You'll all have your own such lists. Early on, as an avid reader, I was learning by osmosis from writers like Mavis Gallant, Margaret Atwood, Alice Munro, Rohinton Mistry, William Trevor, Kazuo Ishiguro, Henry James, Jane Austen, Thomas King. You'll notice, if any of you have read my book, that my writing is nothing like that of any of those people. And it wasn't just sound examples of craft that these authors offered, but also a perspective that over time allowed me to situate the loss of my friend in the larger scheme of history and humanity. You can't read, for example, Mysteries of Fine Balance and ever again truly believe that you're personally hard done by. You can't get to know the characters hemmed into Mavis Gallant's tightly bound realities and continue to presume, as youth often does, that to have control of one's own destiny is a matter of course. Reading Memoir, which I also did avidly, gradually allowed me to have faith in the substance of my own story, unvarnished. It forced me to accept that to write about my lost friend meant also writing about myself. I couldn't tell her story, I could only tell mine, but there was no reason I couldn't let her star in it. Disparate memoirs drew me. As a second-generation Canadian with Polish grandparents, I was gripped by Ava Hoffman's exploration of her Polish roots in Lost in Translation, Life in a New Language. I loved Ernest Hillen's The Way of a Boy, a memoir of Java, for its faithfulness to Hillen's perspective as a child caught up in terrible world events. I mentioned Frank McCourt's Endless Ashes. It was a page-turner that I went back to, not to fetishize the poverty it depicted, but to marvel over the vitality of the voices within. To me, its dialogue was made of pure music. Wason Choi's Paper Shadows and Maria Campbell's Half-Breed deepened and broadened my view of my own country, its many histories and nows and their darker sides, and my place within them. I found touching honesty in Joan Stacey's graphic memoir, Aurora Borealis, permission in Molly Peacock's Paradise Piece by Piece, adventure and important tough questions about my place in the world in Yvonne Blomer's Sugar Ride. All of these books served as models of what was possible. I studied their structures, their pacing, their tone, the details that brought them to life, what they told versus what they left out. And I also turned to books on loss or friendship or both. I mentioned a few of these. John Gunter's masterpiece, Death Be Not Proud, just from a few decades ago, about the death of a son. Simone de Beauvoir's compact, brimming memoir of losing her mother. A Very Easy Death. I've got it here. Beth Keffert's deep dive into female companionship and into the tangle of friendship. Moira Farr's After Daniel, a book about surviving the suicide of a loved one, that also brings a journalist's unflinching eye to the task. And another journalist, Deborah Campbell's harrowing and moving A Disappearance in Damascus, a story of friendship and survival in the shadow of war. Anne Patchett's Truth and Beauty. She's an American author, and it's about her friendship with author Lucy Greeley and the illness that led to Greeley's early death. And Gail Caldwell's Let's Take the Long Way Home, which is an account of her friendship with author Caroline Knapp, who's also a memoirist. So this is yet another account of companionship and loss between two women of letters. These books offered a variety of examples on how to bring a close friendship to life for a reader, how to welcome a reader into the life of that friendship, and or how to gently steer them toward the rift caused by death and the sorrow of loss. But more than this, they offered company, both in my experience of loss and in trying to articulate that experience, especially all the wonder of the before time, the joy that made the loss so significant. How do you find pacing in an ordinary, largely contented life? This was a long-standing impasse of mine that books such as these went a long way toward helping me resolve. Reading on theme has its risks. Patchett's and Caldwell's books raised that doubt. These were famous authors writing about famous author friends, and who were Lou and I? But they also proved how compelling, if well told, the simple story of a friendship could be. So while working on my book, I was making my living as a freelance magazine journalist, and I also turned my researcher's eye to the question of friendship. I read essays on friendship, the philosophers like Cicero and Aristotle. I read ancient poets such as Homer, and they tended to infuriate me for their dismissal of women's friendships, or as in Homer's case, they found the proof of friendship amid conflict and bloodshed. That said, for a time, I clung to this research as if to a lifeline. If you aren't careful, research becomes a clever, busy project of avoidance, the wrong kind of companion. Ultimately, all that reading on friendship didn't penetrate my narrative so much as subtly inform it. But it took some doing for me to realize it belonged between the lines as opposed to in them. There's a little taste of that in the early part of my book, but I'm going to move on to it because I want to get to our last companion, and then we have some time for questions. So companion number 6 is, fellow writers. So finally, actual people in your actual life. These may be peers, they may be colleagues, they may be editors, they may be mentors. Over the years at different times, and I highly recommend doing this if you ever can, if you ever have the opportunity. I've enrolled in different, applied to and enrolled in different programs. Continuing ed writing course at Ottawa U many years ago that was taught by Elizabeth Hay. The Humber School for Writers Correspondence Program. Some programs at Banff that were key for me, the aforementioned literary journalism program and the Wired Writing program. And through each of these, I found mentors and teachers, some of whom have become lasting friends. And I've also found peers, and gradually came to be part of a community of writers that has provided immeasurable sustenance, wisdom, encouragement, company in angst, and of course, friendship. Once through a class offered by the now late gifted Ottawa poet Diana Brebner, I stumbled upon a small group of equally determined, likewise fledgling writers. For years, the 4 of us met weekly, poring over each other's poetry and prose, celebrating what worked and mercilessly homing in on what didn't. We were all in a steep learning curve, and I'm sure at times we steered one another off course. But our commitment to undertake the work of becoming writers together was profound, not just for our work, but for our lives. We mulled the merits of this or that approach together. We passionately compared notes on the books we'd read. We served as one another's audience. We flailed and tried things out. We became, through our linked striving, bound up in one another's efforts, struggles, achievements, and lives. There are those who might find this indulgent. A bunch of writers in a coffee shop, brows furrowed, debating whether Greta the cook really belongs in this story or is just a distraction. Rejoicing over the description of a feather, say, the aptness of a metaphor. Gleefully Xing out adjectives. Spiritedly debating the placement of a semicolon. If you're determined to pit us against a team of emergency room doctors and nurses, we may flounder, especially these days. But ask yourself this: where will those doctors and nurses turn for solace, for sustenance, when their demanding harried day allows? In all likelihood, to some form of art. TV, perhaps. Music. Possibly to poetry. Or to a story someone like one of us took the time to write down. Should they do so, I'd hope the story they chose was set down properly and well, by an author wielding their craft with as much practiced skill as the medical professionals had spent their shifts wielding theirs. This is what my friends and I were learning together, how to do amid the pulsing glow of possibility. This is what my friends and I were learning together how to do amid the pulsing glow of possibility that emanates from such a collective pursuit. In such cases, on some level, whether the story ever gets written to anyone's satisfaction becomes irrelevant. It's the meaningful toil, the coming together over that toil that matters. It's that very glow which, after every session, traveled with each of us out into the street and carried on with us as we walked or drove to our separate houses. An important interjection here: if you're lucky, you'll find some literary peers writing in completely different veins or from markedly different life experiences. You want, for example, the kind of friend I found at Banff in the writer Abu Farman, formerly of Montreal, now of New York, who writes in his introduction to Clerks of the Passage, I have it right here, oops, his book-length Meditation on Movement. This is his quote: "There is some of that redemptive, tragic, personal matter in these essays. What there is, though, is abstracted, pulled out, and rendered as outline. Why this abstraction, as he calls it? Because, though some truths are found in personal subjectivity," here I'm quoting him again, "history flows through us. Structure, biological, geographical, and cultural, sets the parameters of the choices we make. When I read Farman's introduction, I realized my own writing was grounded in the personal and psychological. I considered what that meant and whether I could or should shake up my built-in approach to writing and to thinking. I also recalled our first conversation at Banff about our respective homes and travels, during which I launched into an impassioned comparison of Toronto and Vancouver, and he interrupted with a wide grin of delight to say, "Everything is geography to you." His exclamation was revelatory. It opened my eyes to my own perspective, the things it tended to comprise, the directions toward which it veered. We need friends who open our eyes in this way. We need fellow writers who point us toward paths that we hadn't even known were there. Eventually, Vera Brittain did finish her memoir, Testament of Youth. It became one of the most celebrated autobiographies of the First World War. It was made into a 1970s BBC TV series and a major film in 2014. It remains in print. Here's the continuation of the quote with which I began this talk, in which Brittain admitted how again and again she nearly gave the whole thing up. But periodically, Winifred read what I had written and urged me to go on. "Never mind how long it's taking," she would say. There's a bit of reconstructed dialogue, by the way. "It's got a quality of some kind. Really, I do know this. I haven't reviewed literally hundreds of books without learning to recognize something worthwhile when I see it." She would add with Yorkshire directness, "You wait. You'll wipe all our noses." So I labored on. Many times I did so only because she insisted. Such is one of the particular values for a writer of a stalwart friend who counts sound literary judgment and frankness among her qualities. There are so many companions I haven't touched on here, the people in your life who aren't writers, thoughtful and skilled editors without whom all writers would be doomed, and of course the imagined readers out there who live in your mind, the people you're writing to and for. So you see what I mean about the lonely garret? Forget it. It's most definitely not your home base of choice. How would you fit all this in? Okay, we have a little bit of time for a few questions here. I just want to mention that I think the Wild Writer sends out a follow-up email, and there will be a little handout from the talk if anyone's interested in looking. So let's see what does it say here? How important is creating a sense of place in memoir creative nonfiction? What are memoirs, pieces of nonfiction that you find create a memorable sense of place? So it's super important is my short answer. And I guess, do we have any techniques on writing scenes? I mean, that's something that takes practice, writing. So in a memoir, you have the benefit of writing about places you've spent time in yourself. So you draw on your memories of those places and use as much tangible detail as you can. So think about the senses when you're evoking a place. Think about what it feels like to stand there. Think about what you see if you're standing in a certain sort of, I would put myself in a spot and consider what's around me. What do I see? What might I be hearing? Are there smells? Are there, what might the weather be like in this place? How old are the buildings, if there are buildings? What's growing? What might be moving in and around past you? So detail, detail, detail. And then if you have too much detail, you peel some of it away and you keep the most evocative ones. I hope that's a bit of a helpful answer. Here's a question. Doubt seems like the most difficult companion with so many aspects to deal with. Any advice on how to be confident that your story matters? Your voice is the right one to tell it. Two things I would say. One is, if you can't help but write it, if it feels like you have no choice but to write it, then your voice is the one to tell it. For some reason, this story has to come from you. So so that's one thing. Another thing is use those other people. Find your little tribe of trusted writers and readers, mentors, and share drafts and get feedback and make sure they're people you trust to be honest with you, not people who are going to try to make you feel good about what you did. Um, and also honest in a way that you also don't want people who are competitive with you, because they might do the opposite. So you need people you trust and people who are frank, and you eventually you figure it out. If you feel like you need to tell the story, it probably matters, um, and you just have to find the right way to do it. And that might take some doing. It might take trial and error, and it might take persistence. I feel like there were some questions that I was going to answer before. I'm just going to have a quick look. Oh, maybe I can't find them anymore. If anyone has a new question, let me know. Oh, here's one. Do you have any suggestions for addressing gaps in memory related to emotional trauma, which are vital to the story? You know, one thing I would say, that's a good question, and not exactly having that. I mean, I'm sure I have gaps in my memory from my own story that I'm not even aware of. And there are definitely things I wish I remembered that I can't. And sometimes you can just be frank about that in your story. You know, the way to address a missing piece is to hit it head on and say, this is a missing piece, and here's why I think it's missing. So that's one way you could deal with that gap. Another way is to talk to, if you're able to, if it's not going to be too difficult, and if these people are available and willing, is to talk to other people who might have some awareness of what was taking place in the story you're trying to tell. If that, you know, I realize that may not be possible depending on the circumstances, but if it's a gap you can't fill, you could just address it. You could even imagine what might be in it, and tell your reader that you're imagining it. Maybe it was this, maybe it was this, and even play it out as part of your story, but be clear that it's an imagined filling in. That's one possibility. And I think we're just about out of time. And so thank you all so much for coming. Like I said, I wish I could see everyone in a room. It would be so much nicer. But it's been a great privilege to talk about writing memoir, especially for Wild Writers and the New Quarterly, which published a piece of this a long time ago before it was a book. So thanks.
Thank you, Anita. That was wonderful. So informative. And I think those were some great questions there. In closing, I want to remind our viewers that Anita's book is available for purchase online from Wordsworth Books in Waterloo. And the link for online ordering can be found at wildwriters.ca. Also a reminder that this session, like most of our events at the festival, has been provided free of charge. And if you feel compelled to donate in support of the festival, you will find a link to do so on the festival website. This session has been recorded and will be available throughout the festival if you want to view it again. Thank you all for attending tonight's session. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you, Anita.
Thanks, Lamise.